In this episode, we're going to talk about a book by Ludwig Feuerbach, Das Wesen des Christentums, The Essence of Christianity, which was published first in 1841 and then translated into English in 1854. And I think that you, James, had a teenage experience with this book.
I did. I can't claim to have read it fully when I was about 17. I think I must have read some sort of pamphlet in which there were extracts. But I was struggling through a sort of evangelical background. I had quite Christian parents and was trying to work out what I believed for myself, and was hungry for any text that could help me, that could come my way. And somehow I latched on to Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity. And in some ways, I think it was ideal for a teenager, because it's a book that, read in full, is somewhat demanding and complicated in a Germanic sort of post-Hegelian way. But what hit me hard was the simple kernel of Feuerbach's more elaborated book length argument, and that simple kernel is that the religion of God is really the religion of humanity, that we project onto God those attributes and predicates that we prize most, that are most sacred in our own humanity: justice, virtue, wisdom, benevolence, charity, and so on. This was very, very important to me, because it gave me a kind of license. I'd begun to think these things. I'd begun to think about subject and object. These are words that are very important for Feuerbach. He talks about how human beings need objects, and in our relation to those objects, we are essentially thinking about ourselves. So, of course, as a teenager growing up in this Christian environment, I'd spent, and quite alienated from it, I'd spent quite a lot of time looking at people in and out, in church and outside church, looking at people and how they related to the object called God. And indeed, I'd begun to think, is it possible that this object that they relate to is not an object, but actually their own subjectivity? And it was Feuerbach who gave me the beginning of some license to be able to think that through. And I'm very impressed rereading Feuerbach at the bravery and radicalism of his particular humanism. We can see in Feuerbach a general crisis of the age being worked out. He's born in 1804 in Bavaria. He has a marked inclination towards religious studies. He goes to Heidelberg to study theology, and it all looks set for him to become a pastor. But he's already having doubts. He feels that philosophy and theology are in conflict with each other, and he asks to transfer in 1824 to Berlin, where he begins to sit at the feet of Hegel, and finally does indeed switch to philosophy. And it's that relationship to Hegel that really constitutes Feuerbach's way of doing philosophy and way of thinking, particularly about religion. But I'm struck reading Feuerbach again by this amazing boldness and radicalism. Theology was in ferment. People like Lessing and Schleiermacher at the end of the 18th century had been rereading the biblical narratives with quite a lot of boldness, but they were tentative about going that little extra step. I think even David Friedrich Strauss was tentative about the full conclusion of this radical rereading of the biblical narratives, which might indeed be a fully atheistic conclusion. Feuerbach was not tentative about that. Early in his career, before The Essence of Christianity, he writes a book in 1830 called Thoughts on Death and Immortality, in which he denies the possibility of human immortality, and it costs him his academic career. He doesn't get promoted. He decides to leave academia and becomes an independent writer ever after. So he pays a price for his radicalism.
Thank you very much, James. Before we get on to further discussion of the text, I think we might say something about the translation, because the translation, well, readers now know that it was by the person who became the brilliant Victorian novelist George Eliot. But the name on the translation was Marian Evans, which is more or less the name she was born with. And it's one thing that's very striking is that it is an incredibly good translation. I mean, it reads absolutely beautifully. And at one point, I thought I found she'd made a mistake, but actually there was a mistake in my German text. She hadn't made a mistake at all. And she makes little improvements as she goes along. She explains various words that the reader might find. And she does something very unusual for a translator of German philosophy, that she finds a way of making the sentences really rhythmical and enjoyable. And I think it's quite extraordinary whenever I think about the apprenticeship of George Eliot. You know, she was brought up in the Warwickshire countryside with a very conservative family, and she escaped at the age of 20 to Coventry, where she met up with this extraordinary forward-looking bunch of radicals, and then they had friends around like Robert Owen the socialist, or Harriet Martineau, or Ralph Waldo Emerson, indeed. And she met him, and he was nice to her, and she said to her friend, "At last I have met a real man." And she had very little education, but these contacts put her into the way of writing for the local newspaper, because one of them owned it, but also writing translations. The first thing she translated was this massive 1,500-page book that James has already mentioned, by David Friedrich Strauss, called The Life of Jesus, which was sort of atheistic, and she couldn't stand it. I mean, I think this is a very common experience of translators. She said, "I've got him in my hand and in my head." She almost said, "in my hair." I mean, translating is a very, very intimate business. I've only done short books, but if I did a 1,500-page book, I mean, you really do feel as though you're married to the bloody book, and not getting on very well with it, probably. Anyway, she struggled with that, and she produced this really marvelous version. And then a few years later, she took up the sequel to it, which is Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity. And it's quite true that both of these books, in their way, are statements of atheism. But I think that it's important to contrast it with a kind of atheism that you might associate with the 18th century, which is just straightforward materialism, that religion is priestcraft, it's all sort of magic and it's rubbish, and we should forget about it. Feuerbach's argument, which is so brilliant, is that no, we shouldn't forget about religion. We should respect it, and we should see that it actually means something different from what it thinks it means, and that the real meaning of religion is human. And I think that, well, for one thing, George Eliot did a fantastic job. You should remember that translating German philosophy into English was not a thing at the time. I mean, you could get Goethe translated into English, but certainly not Kant or Hegel. Or, in fact, I think English people reading Kant at the time, if they couldn't manage the German, would use them as a massive Latin translation, which reminds us of how late Latin remained a lingua franca for literate people. Anyway, the fact that we have words like, I don't know, you've already mentioned subject and object, and alienation and estrangement, and that these are all now to us familiar philosophical words. I think that was George Eliot's invention. This was the 25 or 30-year-old George Eliot slaving away at these translations and really inventing a new philosophical vocabulary in English for German thought.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.